So thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the second webinar in a 5-part series that we call Creating a League of Our Own, a Renewable Energy Cooperatives in Canada discussion series. My name is Karen Miner, and I am the Managing Director of the International Centre for Cooperative Management at St. Mary's University, and I am the moderator for today's discussion with some support also from Diamond Isinger, the Director of Advocacy from Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada. So before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I live and work in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I am grateful to be able to work, play, learn, and engage in cooperative activities on these lands. Indigenous and settler reconciliation and reconciliation is essential to our collective work as we build a future grounded in solidarity, human dignity, and sustainability. So this Renewable Energy Conversation series is about reaching for and being leaders in the creation of a sustainable future for all. By joining today, you are engaging in ongoing efforts to connect and mobilize renewable energy cooperatives in Canada. This builds on recent work done by Marc-André Pigeon, Martin Boucher, and Renata Leonard to conduct a census on renewable energy cooperatives, RECs, in Canada. That census helped to identify RECs across the country and outline both their successes and their challenges. Challenges that included scaling up and playing a more prominent role in the energy sector. Building on the census work, this discussion series was created to explore how RECs can make a more meaningful and timely contribution to Canada's efforts to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Each installment of the discussion series will be held on the third Wednesday of each month between now and May at 12 p.m. Saskatchewan time. The sessions are in Zoom. They're free to attend, open to anyone, and recorded and posted to the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives YouTube channel. The discussion series is also important because it leads into an in-person gathering from May 25th to 27th at St. Paul's University in Ottawa. At that event, we will put the ideas from the discussion series into action and see if there is an appetite for the sector to do one of the things that cooperatives have always done to build scale. Collaborate by forming a second-tier entity, a league, or what you might be familiar with as a federation or an association, to improve important or to provide important shared services. So some special thanks to a few organizations that are providing both in-kind and financial support to these ongoing efforts. Thanks to the support from the Cooperators Insurance, Cooperatives First, the Alberta Community and Cooperatives Association, the British Columbia Cooperatives Association, the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives at the University of Saskatchewan, the International Centre for Cooperative Management at St. Mary's University, Royal Roads University, and Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada. So let me introduce our presenter for today's talk on equity, diversity, and inclusion in Canada's renewable energy cooperatives. Dr. Derya Tarhan is an assistant professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto, and he is also a postdoctoral researcher with Dr. Julie MacArthur at Royal Roads University. Derya has built his career around community and cooperative energy, from cooperative development, research, capacity development work, policy advocacy, and consulting. And this experience spans the past 12 years. Today, Derya will share some of the findings from his research into diversity in renewable energy cooperatives. An example of some practical experiences for Derya, he was on the initial steering committee and subsequently on the board of directors of the Solar City Cooperative in Kitchener-Waterloo region of Ontario. And furthermore, his doctoral research was on renewable energy co-ops and the potential they have to advance a just and democratic energy transition. His work in this area was also awarded the Jack Corder Prize in Social Economy and the University of Toronto Graduate Fellowship in Environmental Leadership. So we look forward to hearing what Derya has to say to us today. Over the next 20 minutes or so, Derya will present. As you listen, I encourage you to make note of what surprises you, plus what are you hearing that presents opportunities, challenges, or threats to RECs in Canada with regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And also think about it in the context of what I mentioned earlier, a league or a federation or association. Are there implications for that work? After Derya's talk, we will have time for some small group group breakout sessions, so get ready for those, plus a few minutes for any follow-up comments or questions that come out of those breakout discussions. If anyone is experiencing technical difficulties, you can message Stan Yu, and he will be available to assist. We will be recording the session, and the link will be shared with everyone who registered for the event. All of that will be emailed to you after today's talk. So, Derya, now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Karen, and an honor to be introduced by you. And thank you, everyone, for organizing this event and attending this event. I'm really excited to share my work with you and hopefully get your feedback and hopefully some action items for moving forward. So without further ado, I do want to start my presentation. So the title is Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Canada's Renewable Energy Cooperatives. So our initiative right now around forming a federation is countrywide. That being said, maybe you're going to find it a little misleading because my research specifically focused on Ontario. But I do hope that there will be lessons for renewable energy co-ops in Canada in general. I want to start with the context. So those of you unfamiliar with what a renewable energy cooperative is, it's a cooperative whose primary business or activity is generating electricity or heat from renewable sources. So what's done with that electricity, often it is sold to the grid for monetary income to the members. Sometimes the generated electricity or heat is directly used by community members, and sometimes a combination of both. Renewable energy co-ops have become a significant movement, especially in the past 2 to 3 decades. In Europe, the leading countries are Germany and Denmark. There's over 2,000 renewable energy co-ops across Europe, but a significant portion of them are in these 2 countries. And this is due to specifically legislation that I will be talking about, feed-in tariff programs, which had specific sort of incentives for renewable energy co-ops specifically and community-owned renewable energy projects in general. In Canada, this work is brilliantly captured by Marc-André Pigeon, Martin Boucher, and Renata Leonhardt recently in the census, which a link is provided. Most of the activity is happening in Ontario, and our numbers are still quite limited, with most of the activity happening in Ontario, again, due to the feed-in tariff program that I will be talking about. But it is a growing movement in Canada as well. And most of this, as you can notice, a lot of this is from the global north and the Western world, and a lot of renewable energy cooperatives do generate electricity or heat from renewable sources to sell to national, regional, local grids through a policy mechanism called feed-in tariffs, which we'll talk about. So why is this important from a broad climate change perspective? Well, it really can be a part of a massive movement for community-led transformation of energy systems. It helps with decarbonizing and decentralizing carbonized and highly centralized energy systems. That's where decisions are made behind closed doors by centralized actors, and communities usually bear the burdens of such decisions. Let alone, as a global community, we're experiencing climate change to varying degrees around the world. Those impacts are felt. Second, it can be an engine for community economic development, right? Rather than our resources, our expertise moving outwards, and private companies installing projects in communities and reaping most of the benefits. Local dollars stay locally, local resources are mobilized, and this has massive potential for community economic development. Another important aspect of it is enacting popular engagement for acceleration of energy transitions by becoming a part of energy ownership, energy decision-making, by directly becoming active agents in the energy system. Studies have found that people are much more likely to enact further on environmental issues and to reduce resistance to renewable energy projects in their communities as well. And there's also this potential for social justice that really underlies community-owned renewable energy, specifically in renewable energy co-ops, because of its potential in tackling energy poverty and diesel reliance on diesel, especially in remote and indigenous communities, for enabling electrification through decentralizing, and also for creating economic opportunities for those who need it the most. So there's this massive potential for social justice. That being said, what the research tells us is that, and this is survey-based research primarily from Europe, where most of renewable energy co-op activity is taking place, it shows that the demographic concentration of REC ownership is in the hands of white, affluent, professional class, right, highly educated, and mostly men. So there is this chasm between the potential of renewable energy co-ops and how it's actually playing out. And the studies looking into that were quantitative studies, kind of survey-based, right, just reporting on this. So what I wanted to do was, from a qualitative standpoint, approach this. First, to see, well, is this demographic trend also evident in Ontario? And if so, what are the factors gearing REC ownership towards privileged communities, and in the same vein, away from frontline or racially and otherwise marginalized communities? So I just want to understand that dynamic and how that plays out in the context of Ontario, so that hopefully there are policy lessons, practical lessons for Canada and hopefully beyond. I want to start very briefly by speaking about my positionality as someone who's did this research, and it's what I would, in research we call insider-outsider positionality. So I have both at the same time. An insider being, I'm not a researcher coming from outside and doing research on renewable energy co-ops. I've been an active participant in the REC sector in Ontario for over 12 years, both in community development. I was part of forming a renewable energy co-op. I was in the initial board of directors. I put in a lot of work. I did policy advocacy. I was employed by the renewable energy co-op sector, specifically the federation that existed in Ontario that's now defunct, but also Toronto Renewable Energy Co-op. And I've done my master's and PhD thesis on renewable energy co-ops. So it's sort of a multifaceted engagement with the renewable energy co-op sector, but I have insights that many outsider researchers won't be able to, because I was in those rooms and I put in the effort. But I also recognized always my outsider sort of positionality as one of the very few non-European, I mean ancestry, board members, and I'm previous board member, I'm no longer one, but in the sector. I come from a Turkish background. I'm an immigrant in this country. I'm English as a second language. And there were very, very, very few people who that I found myself reflected in. So I was always quite aware of that. And I was also at a stage in my life where these very projects and everything that I worked in, when those projects finally became to be raised funds for and operational, I was financially unable to invest in these projects. So that led me to the research that I'm going to present today and a lot of my PhD project. I want to talk very briefly about my theoretical framework, which we call energy democracy. I'm currently working on a project on energy democracy with Dr. Julie MacArthur as well. And so the basic premise is that it has very activist roots, and with a very strong emphasis on social justice in energy transitions. And the main premise is the idea that those bearing the burden of carbonized and centralized energy systems around the world, right? Think people living near coal plants, think people living in energy poverty. They have to decide between eating or getting heat, or climate refugees currently, who are bearing the burdens of climate change right now, not in this distant future where certain thresholds are passed. Those people have the least say, least decision-making power, least agency allowed in energy systems. So energy democracy basically is the plan for action, a call for action to reverse this. The prioritization of the needs and resources and engagement of those who bore and continue to bear the burden of carbonized and centralized energy systems. And this is not only about ownership and access, such as through renewable energy co-ops, but it's also about community and collective control over energy futures. It's very much a concern for self-determination. So social justice is at the core of this. So I'm going to start with the policy and regulatory context of renewable energy co-ops in Ontario. So it doesn't all start with the feed-in tariff program. There's actually the first urban windmill in North America at the time is Windshare Cooperative. That's in Toronto. The wind turbine is in the X Center. It's a cooperatively owned project. And it was those individuals who did this without enabling policy or regulatory framework, along with some other environmental leaders that mobilized, found a champion in George Smitherman at the time, who was working on the Green Economy and Green Energy Act, to also include specific consideration for community-owned renewable energy initiatives in this feed-in tariff program. And a part of this also, the Green Economy and Green Energy Act, was the phasing out of coal in Ontario. And what a feed-in tariff is, basically, is the government saying, if you're producing renewable energy, I want to incentivize that. So what I will do is I will give you a 20-year guaranteed contract, a procurement contract at quite a favorable price. The price kept adjusting over the years, but it was still favorable. It was over market prices. And what this does is it makes renewable energy quite a viable investment and is able to mobilize sort of the decarbonization or more investment in renewable energy projects with quite, as I said, favorable prices. One thing about this was that it was at a time of global economic meltdown. It was at a time of the deindustrialization of Ontario's economy as well. So there was this quite almost urgent need to develop and pass it as soon as possible. So this was a policy that was quite swiftly designed and implemented. And one thing that I think is important to recognize here, that the FIT program lasted for 5 years, but it was in 5 what's called streams, 5 installments with different rules. So the first, which is called FIT 1.0, which was implemented in 2011, the way it incentivized community-owned renewable energy is that it had a price adder of 1 cent per kilowatt for community groups to already favorable prices, and 1.5 cents for Indigenous groups, and no price adder for commercial projects, which actually formed a big part of the contracts, as we will see. But as part of this, there was a very broad definition of community energy groups. Renewable energy co-ops were included, but you could also be a non-for-profit, charity, faith-based groups, other sort of community-led organizations. They were all eligible to benefit from this price adder. And there was also the funding of the Community Energy Partnerships Program, which provided soft project development cost support to community-owned initiatives. And one thing that's important for all of us, hopefully co-op geeks here, to include here is that the Ontario Co-op Act actually had to be amended to include renewable energy co-ops as a possibility because of the 50% rule that required co-ops to do at least 50% of their business with their members. But in a centralized electricity system where there was no way to know that the kilowatts generated by the project can go to individual members' homes, a new model of cooperative, which was the Renewable Energy Cooperative, had to be designed, and the Co-op Act had to be amended. What happened during this first stream? So this participant puts it quite well, that large companies scooped in and bought up massive amounts of capacity because it was first come, first serve in terms of applications. There was a certain capacity allocated, and those with greater capacity, of course, put together the applications and the financing rather quickly. And the rest of us, meaning community groups, are going, oh my God, we have to figure out how to fill these forms out. So a massive part of the contracts went to commercial actors, large-scale commercial actors. And community groups were really scrambling to, based on volunteer efforts, as we're going to talk about a little later, put together these applications and try to get into the queue. So there was some mobilization around how this is not fair. This is, this is evidently a community-friendly policy, but in reality, this is not how it's playing out. And as a result, from FIT 2.0 to 5.0, these rules changed. And what happened is that there was now a specific 25 megawatt community capacity set aside for projects that are majority community owned. So what that meant is that for that 25 megawatt, no commercial projects can come in and take that, or at least so they thought. I have another paper coming up on that. But anyway, let me not get off track. But this is for community-owned groups. Just 25 megawatts. You can take your time sort of putting together you don't have to be stressed about the first come, first served thing. And in the commercial stream, so outside of the capacity set aside, there was also a point system whereby projects with partial community ownership also got their applications reviewed faster than those who didn't. So you're incentivizing partial community ownership as well. But now the community group definition, community-owned renewable energy, became limited to renewable energy co-ops. You had to be a renewable energy co-op. The nonprofits, charities are no longer eligible. And another new rule is that each of these co-ops had to have members that are property owning members in the number of at least 50. So it's already, pointing to an issue in social justice that many of those who are economically marginalized might be renters, and there was this prioritization of property owning members. And the CEPP was discontinued, so there's no longer policy, soft cost, project development cost support from the province. So the FIT program then becomes discontinued in 2016. The last stream, FIT 6.0, was canceled. As a result of this, 71 renewable energy co-ops were actually incorporated in Ontario, but only 34 of them had public-facing platforms that you could reach, and there was membership drives. Again, that's another talk. With a portfolio of over 200 megawatts, which accounted to 4% of all FIT contracts awarded. So this was a massive sort of almost 80% of them went to commercial projects, and the remaining 16% went to projects with partial Indigenous ownership. So there's no way to know what's the percentage of Indigenous ownership, but at least partial ownership. So what was the reality? What did the reality of renewable energy co-op development in Ontario look like? One, there was huge issues with accessing financing for these projects. The traditional lenders didn't know the renewable energy co-op model. It's a new co-op type of co-op. And they were perceived as quite high lending risk. So these co-ops had to go prepare packages for applications for many banks, and that was very, very time consuming. And those who couldn't get financing had to partner with commercial partners, which provides additional challenges. Due to a lack of government loan guarantee or grantor financing schemes after FIT 1, a lot of the initial financing could not be completed, so it all relied on volunteer sweat equity. And grid connection and regulatory barriers is something else that I heard a lot about, and I experienced personally. The regulatory approval process, we have quite a centralized electricity system and electricity governance in Ontario, and a lot of the regulators were quite unaware of more decentralized options such as renewable energy co-ops. So the regulatory approval process has been very arduous and long. And then some co-ops who want to raise above a certain level of money had to put in official offering statement requirements, which are prospectus. And that was also a very, very arduous process, especially for a volunteer-run operation. So overall, there is complex preparatory activities and inadequate support is sort of the landscape in which renewable energy co-ops operated, which resulted in long and arduous gestation periods, some folding due to not getting the regulatory approval or the process lasting too long and being too arduous, and just volunteer burnout. And what did it take to succeed? One, definitely sweat equity. Volunteer-led project development, the board of directors had to do almost all of the work with very limited support. And very high practical capacity requirements. Renewable energy projects are quite complex projects. And without support, there's a great amount of disposable time, money, and expertise in all of its forms is required to make these complex projects a reality. So very low support, need for volunteers, and need for volunteers to have these very specific practical capacity requirements in quite a high level, which resulted in, and this is something that I heard from almost every rec leader, is that almost all of our energy went to project development rather than doing, fulfilling our social mission, which sometimes included the advancement of social justice, of community revitalization. But that had to be in the back burner, that had to go to the side because all the energy went into project development. So here's a member telling us about it. Our primary focus quickly became the need to raise capital and the knowledge and the paper hurdle that goes with that and negotiating the complexity of that. We became like any normal enterprise, any capitalist enterprise. So let's link this all to social and racial justice. I was unable to do a survey because of this was post-FIT, this was after FIT, and Renewable Energy Co-op leaders were like, our members are already quite not engaged, and we're not going to burden them further with a survey, but we can talk about it. And what they communicated with me is that it's quite similar to Europe in terms of a lot of our members are green-minded, white, affluent, access to disposable income. And I asked, well, let's try to figure out why. One, this was a top-down policy that was quite swiftly implemented with not enough support in terms of financial or regulatory policy. So the question became, well, if it's dropped in front of you like that, it's evidently community friendly, but which communities are going to become aware of this or the REC model? And which would be able to even consider pursuing such a high practical capacity required activity. And again, this is going to be a theme that you're going to see in the next two slides, high practical capacity requirements in the absence of an enabling policy regulatory framework. Which communities? The answer was local environmental groups with connections to disposable time, money, expertise individuals, to high net worth, high related expertise individuals. Second, the recruitment of board members. So remember that these are your project development team and your volunteers. So you're already a local environmental group with mostly connections to, more green-minded, white, affluent individuals and groups. And there's this need for volunteers with these necessary practical capacity that is disposable, available and disposable to them. So who would you recruit? You would recruit individuals with high practical capacities and who are able to do this, who are able to take on the sweat equity. Who would you target? Well, they targeted from their networks usually, whether professional or through environmental groups, high net worth individuals. So which made the composition of board of directors, which runs the governance of the organization and the direction of the organization, quite white and affluent. Here's an insight. In our first 5 years, the business technical side of the challenge just requires skill set and huge time commitments that were impossible for most people. We're talking 40, 50, 60 per hours per week to just get up and running. So you need people who are aware of the legal field, people with political connections, people with financial expertise, legal expertise, just to make this thing successful. So this just gives an image of what forces really limited the demographic composition of these board of directors. Continued exclusionary factors is the next step. You know, you recruited your leading members, or it was formed, and now you got to recruit investors, investing members to co-ops. Again, where would you go? One of the biggest things that I heard is one of the ways to make them accessible, of course, is setting the minimum investment requirements low so that more people can invest in renewable energy co-ops. But I heard that this did not happen, not because renewable energy co-ops didn't have the vision for social justice, but more members would mean more administrative costs and more administrative work, and they were already stretched thin. So they made the decision to actually increase investment requirements to limit the number of members so that it would become a more manageable task for the co-op for its financial survival. And on the other hand of it is the complexity and risk of that's involved in this new model, renewable energy co-op investment, that most people, because of the offering statements and the requirements and the precarious policy environment, people not feel comfortable with. Again, which is related to high practical capacity requirements in the absence of an enabling policy regulatory framework. So here's the quote that sort of sums it up in terms of why did they make the decisions to that could result in more exclusionary practices in terms of minimum investment requirements. So we have to remain financially viable. So at some level, we have to face reality of the market that it costs as much for us to bring an investor who's investing $1,000 as one who's investing 100. So initially we had a 500 minimum, then we moved it to 1,000, and now it's 5,000 minimum for first-time investors. So unfortunately, we're moving in the wrong direction, but we need to keep our operations as efficient as possible, especially, again, volunteer-run, precarious policy and regulatory environment. So just wrapping it up, I know that I went slightly over time. At the root of all this is initially an exclusionary and top-down policy design process, right? Community engagement was not a priority in the design of the feed-in tariff program or Green Economy and Green Energy Act, which it was part of, which ultimately geared it towards not even community-friendly policy design, but especially exclusionary for racialized and otherwise marginalized communities, because their concerns and their needs and situations and realities were not taken into account, which resulted in a policy and regulatory environment that increased the practical capacity requirements through complex preparatory activities. It made it quite exclusionary. And I think it's also worth asking the question here that, well, even affluent communities with high practical capacities had a very, very long and arduous process. Some of them folded in getting RECs become a reality. Whereas over 80% of contracts went to commercial projects. So was community an afterthought, or at worst, a community washing, making this, trying to increase the public acceptance of this program, especially when rhetoric around windmills were quite divisive in Ontario. So a key finding, I think, key conclusion from my research is that the needs of frontline marginalized communities must be prioritized. Because at the end of the day, these public resources went to communities that really mobilized, did excellent work. I was part of it, put in a lot of sweat equity. Whereas the energy needs of Indigenous communities, urban communities, racialized communities in Ontario is still a massive issue. And I'm also very much happy to be part of this and proud to be part of this initiative of forming a federation of RECs. Excuse me. Because I think that having a federation and having practical capacity specifically geared towards influencing policy design collectively can really help with making the policy design process more participatory, more just, and more broad-based. And I think it's also could be a tool to mobilize and build meaningful connections with groups with a strong social racial justice lens. To have that capacity to build those relations that unfortunately at this stage do not organically exist in Canada. So I will leave on that note, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback and insights.
Thanks, Derya. Just take your screen share off when you have a minute. Super. I'll let you do some coughing on mute for a minute there. So thanks. Yeah, you really covered a lot of ground. I was taking some notes as you went, just as a refresher of the territory Derya covered, starting off really talking about the potential. So keep that in mind, the potential for the community-led transformation of energy systems, but then the reality and potential don't always match up in terms of the desire for broad engagement, social justice. I appreciated hearing the clarity around what is energy democracy supposed to look like, and then the case study of, well, what happened in Ontario and what FIT did allow, what it didn't allow, and what maybe came out the other end. And from an earlier conversation with Derya months ago, it really stuck with me, that TME acronym of time, money, and expertise being what is behind a lot of the success, but then what's missing there, and how do we prioritize, as you called it, frontline and marginalized communities. And that has to be, if we expect social justice, if we expect energy democracy, as you outlined early on, we need to come up with a better model. And I loved your ending. So maybe this federation, that's a part of what role it can play. So I'm not going to say more now, because it's really for those on the call to have some quick conversations. There will be a time for a few comments or questions when everyone comes back, but I did prime you at the beginning, asked you to think about a few specific things. So Stan is going to put what's called a Padlet link in the chat, which is just a sticky note technology. If you just grab that link and open it up, it'll help you guide some of your thinking as you go into groups. Stan's going to put you into smaller groups just for 10 minutes. And the 3 questions were, what surprised you in Derya's talk? What are the diversity, equity, and inclusion opportunities for renewable energy co-ops in Canada? And what are the threats to the success of DEI in RECs in Canada? And then with Derya's final comments around, well, if we had a league, association, federation, whichever word makes sense to you, what help might that be, either in taking advantage of those opportunities or helping to overcome the threats to success of RECs from a DEI perspective? So we'll use whatever information comes from these conversations, plus obviously the research that's been done, to inform the ongoing work of the question about whether there can and should be a league or a federation of RECs in Canada. So your input today will be highly valued in terms of just the ongoing work across Canada, which obviously includes all of you as well in your involvement in these sessions and with other colleagues that are on the phone that are working more deeply behind the scenes. So that link to Padlet's there. Click on it now. Think about those questions and the sticky note piece as you go through your conversation. Really, it's optional. If you like to do that, please do add, because that allows us to capture some of your thoughts. And Stan's going to kick off the 10-minute breakouts. We'll then come back with whatever time we have to remain. And I'm handing the baton over to Diamond Isinger to finish with the moderation for the last 15 minutes. So enjoy your conversations.
Well, thanks for rejoining us and not getting lost along the way as you switched rooms and switched places. As was mentioned before, my name is Diamond Isinger, and I'm the Director of Advocacy at Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada. So just chipping in for Karen while she steps away for a minute. We had a couple of comments come in on our Padlet. If you haven't had a chance to add things there, feel free to do so. But I also want to open it up to anyone that just wants to share aloud. If you'd like to raise a emoji hand, typically you can click reactions at the bottom and then raise hand if you have anything specific that you'd like to share. And if not, I'm happy to put someone on the spot, usually Martin. He's always good to put on the spot, so let me know. You're laughing. That makes me. Do you want to start, Martin? Do you have a key takeaway that you want to share from your show?
I feel like that's where this conversation is leading. We discussed, one of the things that we discussed in the group that was surprising, if we're going to kick up, it was the tension between efficiency. So getting sort of the scale, the magnitude of large investments, this really dovetails well with the work that I did with Mark on the census, that we did find that boards were at capacity, they're working their butts off, and they're almost they're in a sort of survivability state. So it's hard to sort of expand your horizons to include these sort of other dimensions. So that tension and the way you thought about that tension, I think that was one of the surprising things that we discussed.
Derya, do you want to react to that at all? Do you have any comment about the tension that Martin just described?
Oh, I mean, definitely it's it's something that I heard a lot in my research as well, and it's very much connected to everything that I discussed. I think the ability that how all-consuming project development becomes, and a lot of times it leads to burnout. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Martin. And I can Barb, do you want to go ahead? Can I?
Because yeah, you can be the moderator. I just wanted to follow up on that because it actually reminded me. I worked for a long time in a community resource organization, and one of the things we did was run a volunteer center. And one of the things the volunteer center did was support boards in what they were doing and help provide training for them and so forth. And it seems to me that is a big gap. It certainly is in social society in this country, that we do not support boards very well. And Volunteer BC, of which I think I'm still a member, has tried over the years to fill some of that gap, but it's very, very difficult. Board members often don't seem to understand that it really is worth investing some time and even money in training themselves. And we've tried to get, government support for that. So maybe it's something cooperatives should be looking. I don't know what the co-ops do, whether they do, ongoing kind of in-service training for board members and supports for them. But board members really need support. And in this case, it looks like what is being asked of board members is really unreasonable. So anyway, all I can say is, if the co-op, if there's going to be some kind of league or network or whatever it's going to be, then support for those board members should be baked right into it as much as possible.
Yeah, that's a great point, Barb. And actually, coincidentally, I'm also a board member of Volunteer BC, so relevant to several of my interests as well. Any final comments or questions from anyone just before I make a few concluding comments of things to look out for? Oh, Marilyn, go ahead.
Awesome. Yeah, I think like the one really quick thing is I think the Ontario context is super different than I'm BC based and creating an emerging co-op that wants to have a quadruple bottom line. And one of the things that come up is just like, is there any resources that can be shared for people who, I think using, again, the same words, want to really bake in JEDI or DI into a co-op structure in terms, and so that's kind of where we're struggling at. And so I was just curious to actually like resources to get to that next step, even beyond policy. So that's my question.
That's an excellent question. I'm not aware of any resources. I mean, the Renewable Energy Co-op field in Ontario has been quite dormant since discontinuation of the FIT because of, again, the burnout and how difficult it was to sort of maintain. But there's still some, active players in the field, and I know that they're working on it, but I'm not aware of a specific tool for it. I know that there are consultancy co-ops on JEDI, such as Freedom Dreams Education Cooperative, who provide such services that you could procure, that could help you with those plans. But I'm not aware of existing resources, which I think should be one of the priorities actually of the Federation, if it were to materialize.
Awesome, thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Karen, do you want to jump back in or do you want me to wrap up? Up to you.
You go ahead, wrap it up.
Okay. Right as you reappear, not to put you on the spot. So thanks so much to everyone for participating. A link to the recording will be shared in the next day or so if you want to refer back to today's conversation or share it with any colleagues of yours. We'll be continuing this discussion series monthly on the third Wednesday of the month, with the next session being on March 15th, which I believe I am volunteered as the moderator for, actually, so I'll see you there. At that session, we'll be hearing from Dirk van Sintjen, who is president of EcoPower. EcoPower is the largest renewable energy co-op in Belgium. And he's also from the European Federation of Citizen Energy Cooperatives, or RES Co-op. Before I let you go, I also want to quickly shout out a couple of other upcoming opportunities. The first being the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives, hosting their co-op conversion series, or sorry, co-op conversation series. I use the co-op conversion term too often in conversation. Co-op conversation series, which is a fabulous way to take a deep dive into specific co-op topics. So next on March 1st is a session with Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nembard on Black American women moving and shaking US co-ops. Another opportunity is that certainly you should plan to attend our discussion series, as mentioned, on a monthly basis. Another opportunity is coming up on April 25th and 26th, which is 2 days of online learning with the International Center for Cooperative Management on Principle 6, Cooperation Amongst Cooperatives. Or perhaps, if you want to go on vacation, a 10-day in-person summer school in Croatia on co-op law is more your speed. And I'd be remiss not to mention, as someone from Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada, that we are hosting our annual Congress in Ottawa this June from the 12th to the 14th, and we would love to see you there. So more information is readily available, I believe, in the chat. Stan has been dropping some links down below if you're interested in learning more, and we would love to connect with you again soon. So stay in touch via the website, social media, or by registering for the next session. So thank you very much, everyone.